on my, there we go. I'm gonna have to put it on the first page that says hit record, Jen, because it's not sitting in front of me. I know. Everybody help me remember this, okay? Some of you guys are coming every week so far, which maybe means you're only gonna come for the first 4 weeks and then disappear, and I'll be having to remember it on my own, but try to help me remember. I get so excited about doing lecture, I forget to hit record. So, okay, let's go forward. I only heard from Michael and Jody, but other people are going, I don't know, I don't remember. So here's what we have. This is kind of a quick review, but what you want to do before you go into that quiz is make sure that you have all your notes together and that you understand the concepts here. So, okay, yeah. So anthropomorphism hypothesis is that children make God in the image of humans naturally. Okay, so anthropomorphism is basically the idea that we see human characteristics in things. And so in developmental cognitive science of religion, so children primarily, would say that children are looking at God and thinking of God in a human perspective. Developmental constraint hypothesis must reach certain mental stage to be able to make decisions. Yeah. Well, the important thing, that might be true. I have not memorized the textbook yet, so I would not question that your notes are probably accurate. But the important thing about the developmental constraint hypothesis is that it's the idea that this concept of God springs from within, right? So it's the person themselves and their own developmental stage that causes them to understand God. It's not these external forces or sources. And that's in contrast with the indoctrination hypothesis, which is basically people only understand God due to social teachings. So it's basically, yeah, you could think of it as sad, but I think what's really helpful as Christian psychologists, right? And you guys are in training in that setting, is to think of them as two parts of a story. And they're kind of, when put together, so you have a hypothesis and an antithesis, so thesis, antithesis, and then a synthesis. And a synthesis of indoctrination and developmental is that actually these are probably all somewhat true and somewhat predictive of how well or how much children can understand God. So there's a sense that, yes, there is something inside, right? So abstract principles of God, understanding more difficult kinds of aspects of who God is, that's something that young children and even adolescents sometimes cannot do, and there's research to support that. So developmental constraint hypothesis has support. But indoctrination hypothesis also has support. People in different cultures and different social teaching settings do have different understandings of God. They carry those. We are not operating alone in the world. So we learn about who God is from the people around us that teach us who God is, for better or for worse, right? If you're in a cult, it might be a really worse situation. If you're in a pretty healthy religious community, then it's probably a good thing to learn about eternal things that way. So I think it helps. I appreciate that too, Jody, about like learning more about God. And I find that psychology of religion material expands my understanding of the world that God made and helps me understand it better. So I think that's pretty cool, even though sometimes it's kind of sad too, because there are people who also use some of this to argue that there's not really a God. It's all kind of a cognitive, socially contrived construct. But you can make an argument for that either way. So the preparedness hypothesis, what I want you to remember for that is to kind of pair that up with Justin Barrett's research, so that children are kind of pre-wired or cognitively ready to learn about the supernatural and about God and the divine. And then seeing God, and actually it's not just children that see God in human kind of form, it's all. So, C.S. Lewis said that God put things into humanity like an understanding of evil and good that is ubiquitous across humanity, and that children everywhere come to understand that there's an agent called God and very readily accept that those would be things that, perhaps God put inside us. So that helps. And then For correspondence and compensation hypothesis, that's a whole nother area, right? So the anthropomorphism hypothesis, actually, does anybody have their book and say, like, maybe help each other out? What page number? I agree, C.S. Lewis. He just had amazing abilities to understand these things. But those first four hypotheses are on a certain page in your textbook, and I think it's helpful to people. So if anybody can look that up really quick while I'm talking and post it for everybody else to see, that probably people would appreciate that. And then the correspondence and compensation hypothesis on a different page. So correspondence and compensation hypothesis has to do with attachment. So essentially, the simple idea is, however you were attached to your parents, whether that was securely or anxiously or more avoidant with your parents, right? Dismissing with your parents. So however that happens, the correspondence hypothesis would say, if I'm securely attached to my parents, then I'm going to be securely attached to God. It's going to be the same, right? If I have an avoidant attachment to my parents, then I'm going to be kind of avoidant in the way that I emotionally experience God, my God image, right? So God image is the emotional experience of God. It's subconscious. It's not kind of our conscious logical thought, frontal lobe. It's kind of our emotional limbic system experience of God. And so the correspondence hypothesis says, yep, they correlate. But the compensation hypothesis is a really interesting one, interestingly created by an atheist. But he says that God image compensates for parental attachment, right? So essentially, if you grew up and you had anxious attachment to your parents, for instance, they just really weren't very good parents, and you never could really count on them. You never knew if they were going to be there for you. When you were a baby and you cried, sometimes they would get you and care for you. Other times they would yell at you or ignore you. And so you developed this anxious attachment. You never knew what you were going to get from your parents. Okay, so that's the anxious attachment style. It's developed by about age 5. The idea is, as you grow and understand God, getting older, you use God to compensate for that. Well, I couldn't get things from my parents, right? It's anxious there, but I can create a more secure relationship with God. Now, atheists would say you're creating it with a blank slate, essentially something you've created in your head to take care of you and create a secure attachment to. And theists would say that there is a true God there that we're actually attaching to, and God is healing us from our parental attachments that weren't very healthy. So you can understand both of those perspectives as a scholar. So thank you, Jody. Anthropomorphism is around page 89, but the indoctrination hypothesis and everything, I think, is around page 84. They cover those. So pay attention to that. Make sure you kind of have it ready when you go into the quiz with these and understand the basic point of them. Okay. Doing good on time. All right. Attachment to God and God concept. All right. So pay attention. God concept. Thanks, Jody's finishing that. God concept is different than God image. God image is this emotional, subconscious experience of God, right? As being there for me, loving me, warm, right? Available kind of thing. That's the God image. God concept is a little more logical. It's a little more, oh, I know God loves me. I've been taught that, right? Or I've read that in scriptures, or I've had experiences that God loves me, right? But your God concept and your God image could actually be in conflict. You could say, I know God loves me. Scripture says it, and I've heard it from the pulpit 50 times, but internally, I don't feel it. I don't feel God's love. I don't experience God's love, right? This happens a lot in psychotherapy when I'm working with people who are depressed or anxious or had trauma experiences and things. They will have an incongruent God concept and God image. All right, so just want to kind of get that background. So attachment to parents and attachment and God concept has weak, although significant correlations. Does anybody catch that? This is like a really, really small detail. And even looking over everybody's video notes, I only found like a couple people who actually put this note in there. And it might show up on the quiz. So I wanted to make sure that I addressed it with you guys. Your silence makes me think that you don't know. I'm going to go ahead and cover this one, I think, for you guys. Oops, page 11. Okay, good. Oops, sorry, it went ahead. Going back to page 11. All right. So there's some research that all kind of piles in to help us understand this. But the main point you might want to pay attention to is Todd Hall, which is down there at the bottom, argues that focusing on God concept instead of God image is what's producing the weaker correlation. And it is in the video notes, but again, it was a really small thing when Dean Hathaway was talking about Glenn Moriarty's research and Todd Hall's research and all of that. So if you don't have it in your notes, you might want to go back. I believe it's video 4. God concept is a little less personal and less related to attachment theories. Yes, that's part of the theory, is basically that attachment is also kind of an unconscious or subconscious kind of experience, and God image is also, they're both these subconscious, below the surface kinds of experiences of other people and God. And so they're going to match up more, whereas the more logical, conscious, thought through parts of understanding of God isn't necessarily going to correlate with the subconscious or unconscious understandings of God, and that's why you don't get strong correlations. That's what Todd Hall says. It's a pretty good theory, and there's not a lot of research on it. I actually have a student who's doing some research on that right now, looking at God attachment, partner attachment in marriage, because that's a kind of a substitute. That's the adult version of attachment. And she's finding some really interesting things in her dissertation. So super fun stuff. But a couple other things to just understand about this area of research, that maternal qualities tend to persist in children's God image. So basically, there is some correlation there. However, people see their mother seems to be how they kind of feel about God, that emotional experience of God. But also paternal qualities, too, persist in God image. So it's both mom and dad. But people have also looked at people's understanding and reflections on themselves, like how they see themselves as kind of warm or available, all that kind of stuff. And there's a little bit of research, is a little old, from Roberts in 1989, that we may see God like we see ourselves. So that's interesting. And then that God image predicts salience of religion and ability to cope with trauma. And I think that's super interesting for churches, if you're involved in a church, or if you're going to be involved in religious research in any way or something. And that is basically people's emotional experience of God predicts how much they see religion, faith, as important in their lives. And if they have negative emotional experiences of God, then they tend to distance from church, religion, prayer, all those kinds of things. And then they're not able to, access those things for psychological care, for social care, as well as spiritual care, of course, too. So, and then there's a little bit of research on trauma on that. So just interesting stuff. A lot of people doing good research in this area that's been building the good research has been building since about 2005 or so. There's been some good research. If you have an interest in this area, if you haven't gone too far in your paper, that God image would be a really interesting area to research. All right. We're going to cover major findings of the National Study of Youth and Religion. And this was in your textbook. I should have put my textbook right here. There's a section in the adolescent chapter that specifically covers everything about the National Study of Youth and Religion. So, look over that again, make sure that you understand the concepts here and what's happening. But I was going to try to cover some of the major concepts for you. One is just pay attention. It's what's called a mixed method. And especially you guys are being trained in research, right? So I want to make sure, especially if you haven't had your research design class yet, you might be like, what's mixed method? I don't know what that is. Or you might not remember it. So mixed method is a combination of quantitative and qualitative research. So yes, good. So quantitative research is essentially things that are going to be measured numerically. So it's going to be like amount of agreement, right? Likert scales, total scale scores, number of times people pray, number of times people attend church, all those kinds of things are quantitative. Whereas qualitative, they also did that, is interviews, and then they go back and look for themes, and they look for descriptions of how the adolescents are talking about their faith and whether or not they stay in the faith, how they view their faith, all of that. So it's just super interesting stuff. About half of teens said faith is very or extremely important. In the research that they did, and it was a large sample, and they really included a variety. What they're finding is something that's persisting historically and continuing today. Basically, adolescents, they're either adopting Christianity or not religious. There's a very tiny minority that are adopting other religions. And so basically the idea is people come from other countries, they bring religion with them, Buddhism, Hinduism, that sort of thing. When they come to America and they settle in, what's happening very quickly within 1 or 2 generations is that the children are either becoming not religious or they're converting to Christianity. And that's kind of a long-standing tradition that happens when people come to America. So I don't know if that's going to continue into the future, but that was what they were finding in this research. So Mormons were the most likely to hold similar beliefs to their parents of any group. So they talked about how 50% of teens in Mormon families say their parents talk to them about God or pray with them daily. And that's much more than any other group. I think Protestant group, which is of course a very varied group of people. It's a really big, varied group of people, but and they ran in the 30s. So you're talking like 15% less, roughly. And Catholic was a little bit below that, but not by much. And so you kind of get down further. So basically what's happening is the Mormon community has done a very strong push to kind of celebrate and participate and be active in the faith at home. It's a big part of their doctrine in Mormon faith is around the family. And so because of that, their children are adhering to their faith at a much higher rate than pretty much any other religious group. So only a small percentage of teens believe there is one true religion to adhere to, though. So when asked this question, only a small percentage of them will agree with that question, even though all religions say they are the true religion, right? So yeah, Mormonism does have a strong indoctrination involved for the children, especially. All parents truly, yeah. If parents really want their children to carry on the belief, they might want to look into what the Mormons are doing to carry on their faith, because they're the by far the strongest ability to transfer their faith. To share time reading with the Bible and the Book of Mormon. Oh, Christina's a Mormon. Okay, yeah. So you have that personal experience for that. Thank you for sharing that. Appreciate that. I appreciate that we are not all the same here in this class and how we see things in all parts of different groups for our faith. So one of the other things I found in the survey was that beliefs were not that important or were taken for granted. So essentially, people are believing in God, and you see that in the moralistic therapeutic deism concept, but they don't have a strong belief in specific beliefs. They're not thinking a lot about it, that sort of thing. So 4 times a year you're doing that. Oh, yeah. So there's a lot. So it's a lot of activity as a family. So basically the moralistic therapeutic deism essentially sees God, well, basically as their morality, they would say it's do no harm. So it's a very basic morality. There's not a lot of other moral codes or moral imperatives that youth are following in terms of, dress or sexuality or drinking or drugs or any of that kind of stuff. Just don't harm other people is really the morality code. That God is kind of a cosmic counselor, so that's that therapeutic part. And basically, if I have a problem, I can go to God, and God will support me, help me, that sort of thing, and see God in that role. But then also that God is a bit of a divine watchmaker, which is kind of in contrast with that role. Basically, God set the world up, and you kind of get that concept of deism that's out there, that God's not really that involved in my life, not on an intimate level. God's not making things happen around me. So yeah, that God is that separate. Well, they're answering questions that are consistent with deism, is what they're saying. So that's kind of interesting. So maybe an increase or a rise in deism again within the United States. So that's possible. So then what they do is they have 3 stages of this study. They reported really well in the book on the first stage. They have some reporting on the second stage, which is when the kids are in college now. Religious service attendance dropped from high school to college. Probably not surprising. This seems to be true across time and historically as well. Belief in God dropped a little bit, but not as much as religious service attendance. So college age kind of kids are not attending religious services at a high rate. And then they essentially took these results and pulled them into kind of 6 groups. So essentially, teenagers, as they go through teenage and early adulthood, they kind of form 6 groups. So either committed traditionalists, so they stay a Mormon, they stay a Catholic, they stay a Presbyterian or a Lutheran or whatever, and they're committed to that tradition, or selective adherents. So basically, they might still hold that particular tradition, but they're selective about it. So I agree with this, but I disagree with my church's teaching on homosexuality or on drug use or on how we should be in society on this issue or whatever. And they'll adopt a more socially acceptable version of that. They're more spiritually open. So that would be a third group. So they're kind of like, I don't really have a tradition. I don't really have a particular identity. I'm open to all things God. And then there's the religiously indifferent. So this is a group of people who are kind of like, I don't really think about it. I don't really have a strong preference. And then you have the religiously disconnected. So they're like, this isn't relevant to me. So indifferent and disconnected are a little bit different. They describe that in the book a little bit, but they're pretty close to each other, in my opinion. And then irreligious, when people say, I'm not religious, I'm an atheist, or I'm an agnostic, maybe. Although agnostic is probably a little more religiously indifferent. You could kind of be in those categories too, or disconnected. But irreligious would basically say, I am not religious at all. And they would clearly state that as an identity. So, yeah. So that's kind of what's happening in this survey that they did, mixed method survey. So what predicts the transition of faith in adolescence? So as people go from being adolescent to adult, that there is some cognitive context to this. So basically there's something that happens in the adolescent brain and the young adult brain that allows them to be able to, logic and reason and make decisions. And if you talk to an adolescent, you begin to see them doing that they couldn't do when they were younger. And so those that have more cognition that they put towards their religion have a tendency to transition and stay in the faith, basically. A religious ritual and rites of passage, I probably should have put those together. Those two things also are pretty similar to each other, but as communities have rites of passage or families have religious rituals, and take part in that, those predict transitions and staying in the faith from adolescent to adulthood. This minimally counterintuitive explanation also. So this is essentially, if you remember back, we covered this before, that understandings of God that kind of shift just a little bit throughout adolescence and adulthood into having kind of that deeper understanding of God, that more complex understanding of God. And like, I thought it was this because that's my childhood understanding, but now I get this little shift in understanding it more complexly. That creates this minimally counterintuitive explanation about the world. So, yeah, that's true. Rituals are regular and rites of passage are one-time events. So it's different for minority religions and multi-religious communities. And I think this is an interesting thing for the situation with churches today and religious groups today. Minority religions have to put more effort into it. It's one of the reasons why the Mormon Church has put so much effort into educating children in the faith, is because they've always been this really small minority religion. And so they've always kind of understood that, as well as, of course, family being kind of a bedrock of belief, a pillar of belief for Mormon religion. But Protestants especially have been the majority for a long time. And so Protestant churches are viewed as not having maybe adjusted to the situation that it is a much more multi-religious society that we live in today, and more people not believing in a God and that sort of thing. And so if your religion is the majority religion, you actually don't need to do as much socialization of the children and adolescents because they'll get it in society broadly. But if you are a minority religion, they're going to get counter narratives in society, right? So you have to do a lot more intentional and specific training in order for children to stay in the faith, if that's what you want. So vision, the practical part of life. Yeah, that too. Very true. So other religions could probably learn from Mormonism and how they do that if they want their children to stay in their faith. Religious socialization and families is a big one. Actually, families are the #1 predictor of whether or not, and whether the family practices, talks about the faith at home, all of that. Has positive family relationships, religious activities at home, prayer for meals, talking about God, making sacrifices for the sake of faith and the family, all that kind of stuff is predictive, and it's the strongest predictor of whether or not an adolescent decides to retain their parents' faith. And then there's something about relational spirituality, which I'll let you follow up on. But there's a table in your textbook, 5.1, that kind of lists off the predictors that have shown up in research in the past of whether or not children retain their parents' faith. And so look at that and the kind of the area around that when you are studying this. Let's see, and then beyond the family and what happens in the family, peers also is the second most common predictor, right? The second most powerful predictor is peers in adolescents and young adults, and whether or not they are following the faith or other faiths. Mentors do, but only if the mentors are in religious community. So just having like this random mentor person in the faith out there doesn't seem to be very predictive, but whenever people have, youth leaders and, godparents and all that kind of stuff, that does seem to matter. Being a part of religious community matters. An interesting area is that religious parochial schools, so elementary school, middle school, high schools that are religious, there's almost no research to show whether or not kids who go to those schools stay in the faith at a higher rate than kids who don't. The research is mixed, and it's very poor research. So your textbook talks about that being like, this is a huge area. People make major sacrifices to send their kids to parochial schools, not just for the sake of good education, but for the sake of inculcating their faith in, Jewish faith, Hindu faith. All of these things are happening, Christian, Catholic faith, and, no one actually knows if children are staying in the faith who go to parochial schools. Religious colleges, there is some research on that, and it does seem to be a pretty good predictor. Children who go to religious colleges do stay in their faith at a much higher rate than children who do not go to religious colleges. So here you are, you're at a religious college, although many of you are not 19, I think, or 22, a little older, but Kane and Jacobs did a nice study and looked at 7 predictors of college students' adult faith development. So you might want to go in and just kind of read about that. One of the big things that they found is that there's kind of polarization of faith at college age. Like essentially some people stay in the faith and continue in it, and they really kind of stick to it and even become stronger in their faith than they were as adolescents. And then another group of people walk away from it. And that there's not, like, people aren't coming to the middle, they're polarizing. And that there are a lot of cultural influences about that, as well as college level influences about that. So, and finally, I just want to point you to table 5.3 and the associated descriptions on adolescence and religion in general. And this is across various types of religion and spirituality, not including strange cults, but general religions that are generally healthy, that adolescents who are more religious tend to be more healthy, more mentally healthy, use substances less, have later sexual behaviors, less risky sexual behaviors, involved in delinquency less, have better academic achievement, and more civic engagement. So basically on almost every measure of adolescent functioning and well-being, religious kids are doing better than their non-religious counterparts. So, all right, I made it. I was getting a little worried there that I wasn't going to finish. So. Yeah, I think we could study that, though. I think the religious K-12s could actually try to study, what's happening in the moment as kids are being trained, and being trained up in the faith of, whatever faith group they have. I think that's reasonably studyable. I actually sat in on a dissertation of somebody at the education school at Regent who tried to do a study in this as well, and he just had a really hard time getting a good sample. So, you'd think you'd get a really good sample of this, but I think schools just don't see it that way. And even, it's a dissertation, so it doesn't have to be the best study ever, but I think he only had like 40 participants and just can't really find anything with only 40 kids, and it's a hard study to do because you basically need to catch them and then track them till they're at least 25 or so. So you don't want to do that for a dissertation. You want to get your degree and leave. So yeah, you need a good longitudinal study. So somebody needs a good fund, essentially. But I would think that the religious institutions would care about this. They would want to fund it themselves. That would be smart to be able to show that this is working, or even who it works for. Obviously not everyone who went to parochial schools ends up staying in the faith, but are there predictors? Like these kids it really seems to work for, and these kids it doesn't. I mean, I suspect from the basis of the research that the kids whose parents also practice their faith at home, in addition to the parochial schools, would probably stay in the faith at a much higher rate. But yeah, it's intuitive and relational, and yeah, all my friends are there, or our local church has a school, and all the kids are there, and and they do provide good training. Although I'm Protestant myself, one of my kids went to Catholic school for a while, and it was a really good school, and they have very good training, very good education going on. So really appreciated that for middle school training. So any final comments or questions? If you don't have any, you're welcome to say bye-bye, and thank you for coming to class today. I will see you next week. So you guys have a blessed day. Here as we head into June, already 3 weeks in. Christina, I can get them up. I keep forgetting to record until late, but what I will do is I will post the PowerPoint within the shared documents in your group, so people can at least see the PowerPoint information there, and then I will, I have to go in and like convert to MP4 and then upload. So I have a little bit of like, ask me for it. Like if you want it, I'll do it, but I didn't want to do all that process if nobody needs it or wants it. So email me. If you want me to post the recording, I will do it for this week or last week or whatever. Huh. Oh, I have attendance. The attendance is showing up. For me, I have like a report of who attended and like what time people joined and what time they ended. And I'm not super picky about that. As long as you were there for, a good hefty majority of the time. You can't come for 10 minutes and count it. I'm gonna call you on that one. But people are there for a good hefty amount of time. So yeah. So people want posting recordings, I'll do it. It's not hard to do. I just didn't know if people wanted them or not. A lot of you guys are coming to the live class, which is great. It's so much more interesting that way. But I know not everybody can make it all the time. Oh yeah, go back over things. Sure. Okay. I will put this recording up even though it's only the second half. And everybody help me remember to hit record at the beginning. All right? I am a bit of the absent-minded professor. I kind of fit that stereotype.
Probably better now, but
I'm making a note for myself now to post it. Thanks, guys.
If anybody comes near our house, we have $4. Yeah, plumbing don't know better. Really, yeah, they're in their case. But Ruger and that, they're going to test the alarms. Yeah. There's nobody coming in. They're going to do my alarms and things that we have to keep months. Yeah. And honestly,
have a blessed week, Christina.